Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight, and hopefully we'll have some more folks joining us as the night goes on. If you aren't sure where you are, you're at the community conversation with NARAL, Planned Parenthood, and the filmmakers and activists behind an amazing documentary called The Eighth. And I just have a couple of stills that we don't have many slides tonight, just a couple of stills from the movie. You can see all the amazing awards that it's winning. And you know, it's premiering in all kinds of places around the world now. It's very exciting. And I hope everyone who is here tonight was able to live stream. The filmmakers gave us permission to offer that all to you free leading up to this conversation. So I hope many folks were able to see that. I know I cried about 1 million times watching it, and even watching the trailer this week. So we are just so excited to be here with some amazing activists and filmmakers and to have a great conversation. So I'm gonna stop sharing and just give folks a little bit of context. We are gonna have a really good conversation today around the fight for abortion access. And for us in Ohio, this is coming at a really important time. Over the last 10 years, the Ohio legislature has passed 25 reproductive health bans or restrictions, and there are currently 3 more moving in the legislature right now. Plus, I hope a lot of folks are paying attention. We're in the middle of a budget cycle, and the legislature just added 3 absolutely terrible anti-reproductive health amendments to that budget, including an amendment that allows medical providers to refuse care to patients based on moral or religious objections, which would impact folks looking to get reproductive health care, but also gender affirming care. Another amendment making comprehensive sex ed in schools opt in rather than opt out. And another one blocking medical professionals who enter into agreements with abortion providers from working or teaching at public institutions. Plus, we are also fighting in Ohio across or alongside our cross-movement partners against things like anti-protest bills, anti-trans bills, voter suppression bills, cuts to SNAP benefits, and a continued lack of action around gun violence and police violence. So it is safe to say that we definitely have our work cut out for us in Ohio. And we're so grateful to be here with the activists and one of the filmmakers behind the Eighth documentary to make really important connections and gather learnings from across or from Ireland's successful fight to repeal the Eighth Amendment and legalize abortion access. So to get us started, I'm going to hand it off to our other panelists to do a quick intro of themselves. So Aideen, if we could start with you, that would be great.
Hi everyone, and we're delighted to be with you all in Ohio this evening. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Hannah and your organizations, NARAL and Planned Parenthood, for having us. I'm one of the 3 filmmakers of the film. I'm actually based in New York, and I made the film with my 2 partners, Lucy Kennedy and Mabel Boyle. I work in film, that's what I've done for 25 years, and I work in a documentary film company here in New York.
Great, and Andrea or Ailbhe, either, take it over.
My name is Andrea. I am the owner of a nail bar in Dublin called Tropical Popsicle. I worked in marketing for 15 years, far more years than I care to remember. And I came to this campaign quite late, and I approached it in the sense that I had a lot of young women working for me in my nail bar who weren't politicized. And I saw how a small amount of exposure to politics and in their space would actually mobilize them to become, to make these red line issues for politicians. So I set up a platform called the Unreal Issues, which was, we said, throwing glitter on an issue without minimizing it, to try and reach these young women in the spaces where they are, to try and get them on board and fighting, and to start repealing the Eighth.
Amazing.
And I'm Ailbhe. I am a she/her, and I was an academic for about 40 years, of which I am no longer doing, which is actually a great relief. But I was always a campaigner and an activist, well, at least going back to the early 80s. First of all, in the women's movement, where I've stayed ever since, and also then a little later when I came out as lesbian, as an LGBTIQ activist. And I've had the great privilege of being involved in 2 victorious referendum campaigns, our Fight for Marriage Equality, which we won in 2015, and then obviously the repeal campaign. And I've been a pro-choice activist since the early 1980s, and it certainly looks as if that's a lifetime commitment. You have to go on even after a victory. You never win it forever. You have to keep on going, and the battle is also being fought elsewhere.
So much. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Hannah Cervedillo. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the senior organizer with NARAL Pro-Choice Ohio. I am based in Cleveland, and I am just so excited to have this conversation tonight. I had a similar reaction to Steph when I was watching the film, and I remember it was very early in my NARAL career that I was looking on Twitter and seeing the hashtags when it was happening in your country, when folks were flying home to vote, and tears coming down my face. It was so emotional. I can't even imagine how emotional it was for you all. So I'm really excited to talk tonight about the film.
Great. And I realized I did not introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Coleman Baker. I'm the state organizing director for Planned Parenthood Advocates of Ohio. I use she, her pronouns. And we're going to start, if we could, Hannah and I will ask some questions, but y'all are also welcome to drop questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. But Aideen, I would love it if you could start out by just giving us a brief overview of the film for those who haven't had a chance to see it yet.
Happy to. So we call the film The Eighth, and it was kind of a no-brainer at the end of a long list of other titles, because essentially it tells the story of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. In 1983, it was voted in by the people of Ireland to the Constitution, and it essentially gave the unborn equal rights to a woman. So in 2018, a referendum was held, 35 years later, a referendum was held to either retain that in our Constitution or repeal it and put legislation in place. And so in about 2016 or so, Maeve and I and Lucy, we were working between New York and Dublin. We got together, and there had been some key moments, in particular, I suppose in 2012, the death of Savita Halappanavar, because she was refused a termination in Ireland. And these things were just, were blowing up outside of Ireland, and we decided that we wanted to tell this story. And so we set about our journey, and very quickly met some of the key figures in the campaigning, Ailbhe and Andrea, and also people on all sides of the debate. So we set, then the government, within a short period of time, the Irish government called a referendum, and well, their hand was pretty much forced. And we decided to use the referendum, 3 or 4 months of campaigning and then a vote, as the narrative of the film. But ultimately we wove in and out through the political and cultural history of the preceding 35 years so that people could really understand what the situation was in Ireland and what was at stake. And that was, that's that in brief, that's the story of the film.
I think Hannah's going to jump in with our first question. Thank you, Aideen, so much.
Yes, thank you so much for that overview. So I think one of the things that we want to start with is why now? The film described a deep divide that remained in Ireland after the 1983 amendment passed. Why did it take 35 years to get to a place to make that effort? Could it have happened earlier? And what made it possible in 2018?
Ailbhe, do you want to take that?
Should I go on that? Sorry, Hannah, I didn't know who you were asking there.
Whomever.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's always very difficult to answer the question, what would have happened had it happened earlier? Because you just really can't answer that kind of question. I mean, what I can say is that in 1983, remember that 2/3 of the population actually voted in favour of repeal of the Eighth Amendment, and a third voted against it. So it was clear that there was a divide in the country, but it wasn't a 50-50. It wasn't a kind of narrowly balanced divide. And it was very clear to us that we were going to have to, those of us who are pro-choice involved in the movement, that we were going to have to work very hard to pull back what had been lost. Now, I have to say that the amendment didn't actually change the real life situation of women seeking abortion. And at that time, we spoke just about women because we hadn't even begun to understand the needs or even indeed the existence in Ireland of trans people. So I'll use women for that part of the history. And but women had started from Ireland to go to Britain after the 1967 legislation. So the amendment didn't actually change that very much one way or another. Women continued to have to travel for abortion if they had the resources, if they were able to do that. If they, I mean, you know, from travel here in the States now that, you know, traveling for abortion is, you have it all around you. It was the same for us, but it did mean you to change countries, go from Ireland to England. And of course, it's not just about money, it's also about childcare, it's also about time off work, it's also about all kinds of things. But over the course of time, the 1980s were a time of economic recession in Ireland. It was very difficult. It's really hard to bring about progressive change in economically difficult times. But the 1990s, we saw a new era coming in. We had the first ever woman president, Mary Robinson, and that in 1990, that gave us a great boost. And we thought, oh, we can maybe forge ahead now. But unfortunately, we were landed with another referendum in 1992. So this would have been the second. In fact, we had 3 referendums in one. This was following the rape of a girl, a child in law called Miss X, who was known as Miss X. And I'll cut the story very short, but basically she became suicidal, and we had a referendum on whether or not threat of suicide should be grounds for an abortion. We also had to vote on whether or not we had the right to information about abortion elsewhere, and we had to vote on whether or not we had the right to travel. Please bear in mind, Ireland was a democracy, has been since, the beginning of the 20th century, but here we were having to vote on our democratic rights. We actually won those referendums. We said yes, basically, to everything. We need everything. Same thing happened again in 2002. But in that time, Ireland was changing and it was becoming much more economically prosperous, and also, not coincidentally, neoliberal, and also not coincidentally, much more secular as a country. So while 87% of Irish people say they're Catholic, the way in which they're Catholic is much less based on kowtowing to the Catholic Church. It's much less based on going to Mass every Sunday. It's much less based on that kind of unthinking faith. People were beginning to think for themselves. And I think we have really seen a lot of changes in Ireland, and people who come to Ireland or who did over the years would say, oh, but you're really quite kind of sophisticated. And you think, yes. I mean, just because we don't have abortion doesn't mean that we aren't really quite advanced and sophisticated and cosmopolitan and all the rest of it. So it's a really very interesting situation, I think. But we did fight in 1992. We fought again in 2002. And then, it is hard to keep going. But we started off again, beginning to bang the drum a few years later in around about 2010. And then Savita Halappanavar died because a heartbeat was detected. And I know that has a particular resonance for you in Ohio and in so many other states. I mean, Texas is just, has passed its heartbeat law. So she was told she died of a septic miscarriage. And it was inevitable that she was miscarrying. People were absolutely outraged when that happened. Now, that I think you wouldn't have seen in 1983, but we had reached a point where there had been so many revelations of the brutality of the Catholic Church towards women and girls in Ireland. women and girls who had babies outside marriage. Even that phrase, outside marriage, is just so horrible, isn't it? As if, you know, all women have to be stuffed quickly inside marriage and kept there forever. And we didn't get divorced until 1995. So it really was being kept inside there. And, you know, I think that the revelation of the brutality towards these women, many of whose babies were adopted, by the way, in the US, the women never knew what happened to their babies. There were appalling things. People were very, very angry with the way the Catholic Church had behaved for many, you know, so hypocritically. And also very aware after the death of Savita Halappanavar that this was a very shameful situation. So I think that that outpouring of rage that occurred after Savita's death was very important. And we identified that as a really important opportunity. When you see people rising up with passion and getting out on the streets, you know that you've got to seize that moment. And we decided then to make our move and to do something a little bit different. And I'll stop there to, you know, we can take up the story later. But basically we decided not to call for the right to choose, but rather to say we have to get rid of the obstacle to women's right to choose. And that interestingly meant that many people who couldn't quite bring themselves to say they were pro-choice were actually able to become involved in the struggle, because they said, oh yes, that 8th Amendment, it's an obstacle to women's freedom. And at that time in Ireland, the word abortion was not used in public. I mean, it seems incredible, but people would call it going to England. That's what it was called, or taking the boat years ago, or getting a Ryanair flight, or she had to get the Ryanair, you know. And all of these circumlocutions were to constantly, I mean, you know all about this. It's about hiding and secrecy and hypocrisy and pretending abortion doesn't happen. I've gone on for far too long. You should stop me. Actually, you need to stop me. I have to leave it there.
I'll jump in with another question, Ailbhe, that you really beautifully transitioned into, which is about the messaging and the strategy behind the messaging. Because for someone who does this work every day, the messaging of the campaign was brilliant and so strategic. One line that I remember really stood out to me is, to reach a full society, you have to appeal to a full society. So the film focuses on this broad messaging frame that your campaign used to appeal to both like radical pro-abortion activists and also people on the fence, or people who are questioning that issue of repeal. And, you know, in the US and in Ohio, we're really trying to find that line, because we have, you know, folks who are proudly pro-abortion, abortion rights activists, and are, you know, trying to fight the stigma within our own movement. But we also know that there are folks who are coming to this movement as new activists, as Andrea talks about a lot, with a variety of backgrounds and experiences. So I guess my question is, how did y'all decide on such strategic messaging, and how do we continue to bring new folks into the movement without stigmatizing or sacrificing the values around that we want to keep strong around abortion rights?
Okay, I think I'd probably take that one. I mean, it is complex. And first of all, I would say that, you know, there is no one size fits all messaging template. So you always work from the context that you're in, politically, socially, where the right to choose movement is there a feminist movement, and so on and so forth, what are the religious elements there. You have to take everything into consideration, and you also have to be prepared to be patient and to go slowly. I'm talking now from the Irish perspective, and we knew that the more traditional, at that time, pro-choice arguments were not working anymore, if you like, in Ireland. But they never had worked. We never had actually managed to outright get the government to ask us a direct question, do you want abortion law or not? So we knew we had to do something different, and we had to address a different constituency, because I think there can be a tendency to talk to the people who are on your own side. But actually, funnily enough, you need to mobilize those people, which is very different. They don't need messages about abortion. They need messages about getting out on the streets and canvassing and how to use social media and do all those kinds of things. The people that you are the people that you're trying to bring on board are the people who, as you rightly say, Stephanie, are on the fence. We called them very often the conflicted, people who were conflicted. They were undecided. There was an emotional strain there that you could break through Catholic Church teaching and the law. You could probably break through that, and if you could reach their fundamental humanity, so to speak, which had actually been touched by the death of Savita Halappanavar. So we saw that happening, and we realized that if we could create messages which encourage people to feel compassion for women and pregnant people who are in difficult situations and circumstances, that would really help bring them to see themselves as people who had compassion. But that was a process that we arrived at by doing quite a lot of, well, for us, given that we've very little money, of doing focus group research and talking, having professionals talk, researchers talk with people about what were their fears, what were their reservations, what were they really afraid of. They weren't actually afraid that the sky would fall in if there was abortion law. So what was it they were really afraid of? And generally people found it hard to explain exactly what they were afraid of. But we did realize that fundamentally what was at the base of their reluctance to get off the fence was this sense that it was killing babies. They had stopped thinking in a way of women as murderers, but they really felt that abortion, that it was primarily about killing babies. So it was really important to broaden out that understanding and to help people to see that this whole issue, it is about women. It is about people who are pregnant. That's who it is about. These are the people that we need to be thinking about. These are the people that you do have compassion for. This was what happened to Savita Halappanavar. And then, of course, you're weaving in the stories as you go of all the difficulties that people reach. So ultimately, we moved to a situation where we boiled it down to, very, very, very simple things. We said effectively to people, you care about what happens to women and people who are pregnant. You care about that. That's something that matters to you. So think about that care. Your care needs to be for those people who are there in front of you, who are your sisters, your mother, maybe your daughter, your cousin, your niece, your neighbor, your whatever, these people, your workmate, people all around you, the people that you know, that you love, that you do care about, they need this care. So care became a very central message. Really interesting when you think how care has come right up to the surface in the pandemic because of COVID and the importance of women and of care and how women provide care. And then the second message really was that compassion really matters, that you are fundamentally compassionate when you think about what has happened to, or what the fate is, or you think about the suffering of women who have to travel, who are denied abortion and so on. And I suppose there was always a third message in those 3 C's of care, compassion, and change, that it's time for us to change, that we have a different understanding of life. We have a different set of values. We have moved beyond that history, which was so cruel and so brutal. And we never really had to spell out the history very much. People had it there. And I always said that there was a kind of 4th C in there, which was choice. But we never really spelled that out very much. We didn't talk that much about it. And so we moved really from abortion being all about morality, it's good or bad. And basically, for most people, they saw it as bad. And we said, well, it isn't really about that primarily. Everybody has their private morality, but that's not for us publicly to be commenting on. What matters is, how do we care for people when they're in difficult situations, when they need something? So abortion became much more about a need. It became much more about health and well-being. It became much more about us caring not just for, because that's condescending, but caring about women. So and it also then moved us away from the fetus, the baby, primarily to where actually I think it ought to be anyway, to looking at real live women and pregnant people there in front of you, beside you, and maybe that is you. And that also moved us away. We never said that abortion wasn't a human right, because I think we all believed in the campaign that it is a human right, but we didn't emphasize that. Rights are very abstract. You can talk about rights all you like, but people don't see people. They see some kind of UN thing written up there, and they don't even know what it says. But when instead of talking about rights, you're actually talking about the realities in people's lives, it works very much better for them. So we were constantly shifting and reframing that positioning, I suppose, and understanding about abortion. And that worked for people in Ireland, because I think we had been through, and we're still going through, a kind of transition period in terms of our values vis-a-vis Catholicism. And we moved away from that, and people in a way didn't have anything. At one stage, and I'll finish on this point, the Catholic Church was the primary authority, the guiding light for all your behavior. That's the way I grew up, but somehow, and people believed priests. But I remember at one stage during the campaign, after particular poll results, well, I think it was around about 2017, saying, oh my God, the polls are showing that doctors are the new priests. So the people were believing if doctors said this is what women need, it's healthy for them. And some doctors did. We had to pull the doctors, forward, and a lot of them never did. But that was so interesting, that you have to look at where people's beliefs are and where they shifted to, and not make assumptions about them. You need to explore them. That was what I learned.
Thank you for sharing that. So to the tune of bringing new people into the fold and making room for new activists, Andrea, I wanted to direct a question towards you. Your perspective as someone who hadn't previously considered themselves politically minded is very important to show that we need to make our movement accessible to everyone. We know that the movement is really varied and diverse, and there's not necessarily one mold for an abortion rights activist. I remember when I was watching the film, I loved the line, imagine if you can get this army of women who are disengaged to start to engage a little bit more and to feel empowered. So what do you think your best practices or your personal experience, whatever you want to share about it, for inviting folks in from every level of experience or different mindset?
I think because where we started was very much we started very much in the nail bar, and it was watching the difference between our WhatsApp group from we had a politician come in to get her nails done before the general election, and the girls had no interest in politics, and our group chat changed immediately from glitter and crack into how's the count going, what's the constituency numbers, and all that jazz. And I kind of looked at that and saw that it was actually because the politician had come into their space, rather than expecting the girls to go searching for this, or to kind of go into places or media or wherever they got their information that wasn't their space. So immediately I kind of sat down into a PR perspective of like, okay, how do you create a platform that allows these women to have these messages in words that are, and their colloquialisms that are their own, and how do you speak to them in that way and bring this message in a way that's interesting and fun. And I know that Ailbhe always gives out to me about this point, but I hate protesting. I hate marches, and I know how important they are. Let me just put the disclaimer there, and feet on the street is the number one thing, Ailbhe. But it's just not my buzz. I don't enjoy it, and I do them, but like I knew that if I felt like that, and I was quite passionate about repeal, that there was more people who would be the same. So I was like, how can we get them to reach them in the way that they want to do it, and how do we maybe do this? And a lot of the campaigning, that there was stuff that was done that was, and obviously there's a place for righteous anger, 100%. I don't engage with anger and that kind of campaigning, and I knew that other people wouldn't. So I was like, why don't we make this fun? And even though it's a very serious issue, going back to that thing of throwing glitter on the situation, it was like, how do we make it very easy to access? How do we make it something that people want to join into? And how do we make them want to share it? So it was very a tiered approach that was social media led, but also celebrity driven, also a lot of art, also a lot of creativity, so that people were tapping into these different networks, and we were tapping into people who could bring their messages to their audiences, so that it wasn't expecting people to come to our platforms, because people who come to your platform are already bought in. We wanted to get people to talk on their platforms. And when I started, even when I started, and as I said, I was quite late to it, it was maybe like 3 or 4 years before the referendum, people wouldn't put it on their social medias, because we were tapping into influencers and celebrities and asking them to maybe like share some artwork or wear a badge or like become the fashion of whatever the brand was. And they were like, oh, I'm not really comfortable with it. So we had to get a few trailblazers, and myself and my friends kind of did a lot ourselves. And even though we didn't want to put ourselves front and center, it was a case of making people feel empowered. Well, they're talking about it on their social media, it must be okay. So it was tapping into all those influencers and getting them to put it on their social media, then asking them to ask their friends to share their stuff, and letting that kind of filter out, so that if people felt a bit more comfortable, and changing the wording around so that it wasn't like we had influencers who would use colloquialisms around abortion, so that it's, and bringing those different types of words in, but giving people the freedom to do it in their own way, and not kind of going, well, these are the way we do it and this is what we expect you to do. It's like, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, go off and do your own bits. And that kind of resonated with so many people, because they were doing it in the way that their audience appreciated as well. So I think that was what worked best for us. And like, even when we were like briefing in artwork or whatever, it was always like, let's make this beautiful, was always something that was key, that people would want to wear or want to share, and that let's make it positive and bright and colorful. And that was always in our brief. So whilst there was a lot of of artwork that was very rah or whatever, ours was always lovely and shiny and bright and gorgeous.
That's amazing. Thank you, Andrea. It's so important to show like just the different ways folks can be part of this movement. And I do definitely want to touch on later the importance of art, but I do also want to, since you're talking about like tactics and marching and protests, I want to talk about one of my favorite tactics that we saw really well represented in the film, which was deep canvassing. And I don't know if that's what y'all call it, but that's what we call it here, when you're going door to door and you're having those one-on-one, really deep, real, genuine, tough conversations with folks. It's such an important tool. I would love to see, like, in the chat, if anyone's ever like done any deep canvassing or door knocking for a campaign or an issue, because it's just something I think everyone should learn to do. And it's so important for grassroots activists. So can anyone on the panel talk about more about what deep canvassing is and why it works, especially for an issue like this?
I was just going to ask Andrea to speak on that first, because she went on her first canvas while we were filming, and she did, and she was part with Una Mullally, a journalist. They had an amazing weekly podcast that we were also checking in on as a timeline of the campaign. But I think it's some of the best one of the best scenes we did. But Andrea, I don't know, because there's so much you were chatting about as we were filming, we didn't even get into the film. But it was quite a transformative experience. I don't know if you want to talk about it a little.
Yeah, I suppose when myself and Una were talking about it, and Una has canvassed a lot for different campaigns, and we were talking about, she's like, so obviously you've gone canvassing. I was like, oh God, I haven't actually. And she's like, you really need to go, because that's where you win people over. It's like, okay, fine, I'll do it. But it was kind of scary at the start, because you're going into these spaces that is very much someone's personal space, and knocking on their door and asking them to let you into their time and their conversation. So it was all, and I think it's really important to learn how people talk and how people interact, and how much you want to go into the conversation and how much they're willing to give you. So it is very important to be good at body language analysis and all that kind of stuff that comes naturally, obviously. But yeah, it was very stressful at the start, but then it became really enjoyable. And I suppose when you're going in on a conversation like abortion, it's kind of intimidating because you don't know how people are going to react. But I think I was lucky, and I feel very privileged in this campaign because a lot of the hard work had been done before me. So when I'm going into canvas, a lot of people were like, yeah, obviously, I think, and like, even if they weren't pro-abortion, they were really on board with the women's right to choose and the fact that we needed to have a country that provided this. So it was actually very affirming and very it kind of inspired you to want to do more and to carry on the campaign and to motivate you. And so you were getting as much out of the canvassing as the people who you were talking to. So I think in that sense, that's how I found it.
I mean, I actually think, it's interesting. You call it deep canvassing in the States. We just call it canvassing. And it's an absolutely essential part of electoral campaigns. We don't canvass very much for other campaigns, but certainly for anything to do with voting, whether it's referendums or elections. People in Ireland don't really consider that you paid them any attention unless they get canvassed. And it's that, and you're absolutely right, it is that moment, that encounter, that between the person on your doorstep who knocks on the door and says, I'd like to talk to you about such and such, and you think, oh, you feel I am participating in the democratic process. I am having a real conversation about a political issue or about something I really care about. And that's very important. But at the same time, I would never underestimate the difficulty of canvassing on a topic like abortion. In fact, we found that there was a less virulent response or less toxic response on the doorsteps than we had feared. But there were certainly times when canvassers got a hard time. So trying to put in place the kinds of support and care structures for people who are out canvassing was actually a huge ask for us. And I'm not sure that we always met it. I don't think we met it adequately. Different parts of the country did differently, but that's also something you learn. We did give people a degree of training, and we also had a canvassing book where people were more or less given scripts and language, but they got quite cross about some of the language and said, I'm not going to use it, because we were saying, try not to use the word choice, basically. They said, what do you mean? I'm pro-choice all my life. Of course I'm going to use it. But we were saying maybe use decision, because if you say I'm pro-choice as your first phrase, people just slam the door. Whereas if you say, I'm just interested to know what you think about repeal of the 8th Amendment, they don't really know what repeal of the 8th Amendment is. So they're going to say, oh, what is it you want to talk about? And I think we learned a lot about what you don't do as much as what you should do. A little bit sadly, it was only halfway through the campaign that we learned that. But I do remember, one occasion when when I said I wanted to talk about the 8th Amendment and were they interested in having a conversation with me, and the woman said, what is that? And I said, well, it's really, we're trying to ensure that women can make their own decisions about whether or not to have a baby, if they're pregnant, whether or not to have the baby. And she said, oh, she said, yes, you mean you're one of those pro-choice people? Right, I'm on your side, she says, So we could be too coy as well. But I think Andrea is also right in the sense that, I'm not only a feet on the street person, Andrea. I'll get you for that later on. That's because, she's really maligning me appallingly here. It has to be part of an overall campaign. Canvassing is not a standalone thing. Social media isn't a standalone thing. Your great political high-level strategy is not standalone. All of these things have to be connected. And I think because it was such a young movement, they wanted to get out there on the streets, but they were also social media savvy. And they were, connecting in and learning and, TikToking, well, not actually TikTok, but TikToking with one another on all kinds of ways of how to do it, and giving one another support. Because trying to support people, it's really, really hard.
Y'all have been doing a fantastic job of segueing into our next questions. So speaking about tactics, we use to have these conversations with folks. Obviously, deep canvassing is very important. We also know that storytelling is an incredibly important tool. We use it here a lot in our conversations. This story segment of the film was so impactful. The overlapping voices portion. Someone you know needs you to vote, looking abortion in the face. We use these lines here as well. So Aideen, I wonder if you would maybe speak on the power of storytelling in the campaign and how it was used in making a film.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, I suppose as a filmmaker, we're storytellers. And this is a social issue film. And so we wanted, like, the most important thing for us making the film was to make a good film. And that was probably because you want people to watch just as much as a campaign. You've got all of your strategy around that. When you make a film and you ask someone to sit down for an hour and a half or leave their home, as it used to be, to go and watch it, you want people to stay engaged, and you want them to think about what they've just seen, particularly when it is either a political or a social issue. And you hope that you will move them, not only just in their minds, but also in their hearts. And so if you've done that, then you've done your job well. And then a film like ours then just lifts up the issues and hopefully, as I said, asks people to engage with them maybe a little bit further than they might have done before they saw the film, and just becomes one tool in an ongoing conversation. And then it's, you know, back to the work that you and Stephanie are doing here, using the film in like a conversation like this to take it to the next step. For us, for the women's stories, I suppose because I myself, all three of us, Lucy, Maeve and myself, had grown up under the 8th Amendment in Ireland, but I had actually travelled to London for an abortion in my early 20s. And so there was another piece, Ailbhe talked earlier about how much Ireland had changed. I mean, one of the things around abortion, and it was funny because I was thinking, I always used the word turbination until the 2000s. Was the silence. And I hadn't spoken much about my own experience. And, you know, so the women's voices in the film were critical for us. I mean, they were the lived experiences. They were the testimonies that spoke to the harshness of the 8th Amendment and what we needed to do to change it. I mean, they were just absolutely critical in the film, and I'll let Ailbhe or Andrea speak to how they were in the campaign. But there was a moment in the film where we were with Ailbhe and her team. And I will say that there was so much we couldn't put into the film, and there was so much, as Andrea talked about, all the activism. There was a wonderful organization that used to gather women together in restaurants, in bars, and share a story, and then inevitably other stories came. And it was usually a closed event, and we thought about filming it, and it just felt like, no, that was so intrusive, we just wouldn't. But we were with Ailbhe and her team, and she was having a meeting with them, like a weekly meeting, and Lynn, one of the team, started to tell us, and it's in the film, this moving story about an incident that had happened with her sister. And, you know, I still, you know, can feel the reaction I had listening to that. And I looked at our camera person and our sound recordist, and I could see how deeply moved they were. And watching, Andrea was moved, and the other 8 or 9 people in the room were so moving. So that I suppose in a nutshell was it. And then we were, just to speak to Lucy particularly, one of my co-directors, traveled all over Ireland to get those stories. And it was difficult because the stories, there were a lot of stories at the time and people were being asked to speak. And as Ailbhe said earlier, it is a deeply personal thing. But ultimately this was a campaign, it was a political campaign. And so we were, you know, we spoke to those women, we spoke to them several times, we questioned, we completely with their consent and how we wanted to use it. Did they want to be named? Did they not want to be? Did they want to be on camera? Did they just want the audio recording? And so that's how we, you know, respected, I suppose, what they shared with us. And it is one of those powerful pieces. So thanks, Hannah.
It's so interesting the way women would say to us, it was very difficult for me to tell my story, and you know, all the kinds of protocols that you observe to do that. It's still very difficult. And then they would say, but you know, it's been like a catharsis. I feel I've shed something. I have, you know, left that burden. I've let go of that burden of silence and secrecy. If silence can be a burden, that they let go of something that they've had to keep deep within themselves for so long. So while it was heart-wrenching, at the same time, it was something women really wanted to do it. And there was a very beautiful project called In Her Shoes, which was actually started by a young woman on Facebook who she simply said, you know, can you imagine yourself walking in the shoes of someone else? And it became also a visual thing. So people started sending in their stories, and they were very, very moving stories. And then it became a material reality. There was a beautiful installation in several towns of Ireland with just pairs of shoes lined up in the middle of the street, and just in her shoes. Can you walk in her shoes? Could you imagine? And that was the appeal to compassion. Can you imagine what it's like for that person? I thought that was a really beautiful, very beautiful project, and very moving, because really we say, oh, we've got to move people's hearts and minds. The mind you can take care of. It's not that hard to speak to people on the level, the cerebral, the level of mind. What's really hard is to reach the emotion. It's really hard to reach emotion in such a way that opens it up rather than closes it down. And I think the stories of the way that you do that, you can't do that by somebody like me sitting there and saying, or standing there and saying, these are the arguments for why we need, etc. That happens when you listen to somebody and you think, oh my God, what a life. We have to do something about that. And you feel moved so that you move forward to do something.
Yeah, thank you. And I always think to myself, you know, how difficult would sharing those stories be if folks were free from the beginning to really share their experiences? I think a lot of that heart-wrenchingness comes from the stigma that so many people experience. Yeah. But switching tacks for a little bit. So for many years in the US, and really being amplified right now, there is an ongoing conversation around reproductive justice, led by Black women, and how that concept adds a much more intersectional and cross-movement lens to the reproductive freedom movement, because it brings in this idea that abortion access looks really different for people of color, for trans and non-binary folks, and that reproductive freedom actually encompasses much more than abortion, or reproductive justice, I'm sorry. So it brings in issues like police violence, environmental justice, economic opportunity. So I'm curious to know if that's a conversation also happening on the ground in Ireland's abortion rights movement.
I would say it's a conversation which is happening much more now than it did before appeal. And even in the actual referendum campaign, I don't think that was not a very marked conversation. Now, our histories are different in Ireland and the US, and I don't think we should confuse them. But Ireland, like, you know, elsewhere in Europe, is quite a racist country. It's a pretty racist country, but that racism had been very much denied, not acknowledged. And of course, it has come out very much more into the open, not least because, of course, of the power of the Black Lives Movement. So that's something which has come even more to the surface now than was the case at the time. With regard to trans people, interestingly, after our marriage equality referendum in 2015, we had also, just a couple of months later, a really important piece of legislation, which was our trans equality legislation. Our services in Ireland are not up to scratch for trans people, particularly in relation to health, but the law is actually a pretty good law. It has some problems with it, but by and large, it's very good. So there had been quite a lot of conversation and public attention paid to trans issues. I mean, it's still very, very, very much a work in progress, but we were certainly very aware during the campaign of the importance of including, or of making it plain, that trans men and intersex people, I think at that stage, actually, we weren't even talking very much, if at all, in Ireland about intersexuality, but certainly that it was important to make it plain that whatever we were fighting for was for anyone who could become pregnant. although the language was and still is to some extent about for women and pregnant people. Okay, so, you know, these things get worked out in different ways. If we were having the referendum now or next year, I think that issues of race, ethnicity, and other minority groups, including women with disabilities, for example, I think that they would be much more to the fore, because there was a sense of anger among some groups, certainly, that they did not feel themselves to be at all visible or sufficiently visible during the campaign. So it's, I'm not justifying the campaign at all, but saying it is interesting to see how that has been an evolving process. So I'm off to a meeting tomorrow, for example, which is really women with disabilities who are expressing their anger at the moment about the extreme difficulty for women with mobility disabilities to access abortion in Ireland, and also for people with different neural pathways to access abortion. So, I mean, it's really interesting that it is raised, all of these issues are out there much more on the table than they were before. I don't know if that's really answered the question, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think the same here. It's an ever-changing, ever pursuing, being centering as many folks as possible that we know are most impacted by a lack of access to abortion, and even trying to get our champion politicians in the Ohio State House to say pregnant people instead of women is still a struggle here.
I think one thing that does occur to me, I mean, the reproductive justice movement has always seemed to me to be really important for all kinds of reasons. I mean, it always, and it still feels to me that it was absurd that there we were just fighting for abortion when there is so much else in relation to reproductive health care that women actually need in relation to maternal health care, perinatal care, all of that, but that we were obliged to focus on abortion for 35 years in that way, because that was specifically where the big block was. And people say, oh, wasn't it great you got there in the end? And I do say, yeah, but think of all the other things we could have been doing for those 35 years. Sure, we would have completely recreated the world, but we didn't. We had to fight that issue.
Yeah, 100%. So we're coming up on the end of our hour, which like that just flew by. One thing I did want to get to before we ended was just the role, and Andrea, you touched on this a little bit, the role of art in activism. And I think this could be a question for, you know, anyone here. But, you know, there was great shots of the repeal mural, and then the mural being taken down, and then, you know, the nail art that you're doing, and just all of the amazing art that you see in movements and what that adds to a movement. So I'm wondering if, Andrea, you could talk a little bit about why that's important.
So the mural acted in a very particular way, because there was so much art that was made around repeal, and there's so, like, you know, who I do the podcast with, she released an anthology with all the art and the written word, the poetry, the music, there was artist movements who were doing processions. There was all these beautiful flags that were made. There was like so much, but it provided this focus on beauty, and that people relate so intrinsically and heavily to art and to the visual, and that it makes it easier to wear it, it makes it easier to share it, and it makes it an easy pathway that doesn't have to be a conversation a lot of the time. It can actually do the work that you maybe are not ready to do. And that was kind of the thing with the mural, that we wanted to position it in a place that was really centre in this capital city of Ireland, in Dublin, and that it was right in town, and that you would pass it. And that goes back to why we made it so colourful and positive, that it would start conversations for people who would see it, and then start their own conversations wherever they were at, rather than having to start the conversation where you're at, and figure out where other people are, that they could go on that journey themselves by engaging in the art in their way and wherever they were. And I think that was a big learning for us, that we never tried to kind of talk to people just where we were, and always being cognizant of that people were at different places on their journey, and not to like not to make them feel uncomfortable that they didn't know as much as you, or that they weren't as informed, or that they didn't know what was going on as much as you, that it was very respectful of people where they were. So I think that was what we found. And obviously the mural, the having to take it down and put it back up is something that spurred people to be angry about the other issues. And I think there was a bit of pushback around the time. It was like, well, can people not get angry that we can't access abortion, and not that the mural's being taken down? And again, that was it was a gateway into getting people, if people were getting annoyed about this, and then they'd kind of move into the movement a little bit more, and kind of then they could channel that anger. So again, it was like respecting that where it was. So I think it's a real leveler art in itself, and that goes all the way down to nail art. And the nail art became really, really popular, and we started doing it just on each other and putting it up on our Instagram, and then people kind of brought it in to be their own conversation starter, so that if someone looked at their nails, they could have a conversation with people, and could maybe bring it up at dinner tables or whatever, where it wasn't something that might come up on its own. So I think it's a soft entrance. It's an easy way in. And I think sometimes when there's these barriers up against people that you're not sure where they stand, or you're not sure if this is a comfortable conversation to have, that allows you to open it up and to dance around it maybe until they dive in and tango.
Thank you for that answer. I think that art is a big part of the work that we do here, and it brings new people into the movement. And so I appreciate that, that perspective. Echoing Stephanie, I think that we can have this conversation for hours, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time, especially the folks that are coming from overseas to this panel. So just the one question I think was in the chat that we didn't get a chance to address yet. Somebody was curious about the focus groups and who performed them, and kind of how long was that a tactic for? How long did it go through?
Well, it was part of the process of developing our strategy, and that went back to, started with the process that started at the end of 2015. And what you have to do first is find the money to actually pay for the focus group work. But basically, we worked with a wonderful woman who has her own research company. It's really a one-woman company in effect. And we worked for quite a long time with her, for several months of meeting on and off, to work through what it was exactly we were looking for. And in the end, we did 3 sets of focus groups. There were 4 focus groups each time. And we did focus groups in primarily rural areas, in urban areas, and also, we control for age and a number of other factors, what the original position was on abortion and so on and so forth. And we did that, we did some in 2016, beginning of 2017, again in 2017, and again actually just halfway through the actual referendum campaign, which was about 12 weeks long, so to see how we were doing. And that was really, really, really very interesting. And also working together, because several organizations came together within a coalition, to be a kind of consortium, really for financial reasons, pooling our small resources. It meant that we were working together very closely. So by the time it came to the referendum, we were all very well used to working with one another. And Andrea was very much part of the coalition and knows how important, actually, I think ultimately it is when you're drawing people together across, because I think that was another great strength, that we drew people together. But the focus group work, I think the trick is to get a researcher who is not primarily a commercial person, who is more interested in doing focus group research on social issues, and to work closely with them. And truly it was invaluable, absolutely invaluable.
Awesome. Thank you. Rebecca, I believe that you were the person that asked that. I hope that answered your question. Okay, I think that we are going to wrap up for tonight. Steph, if you wouldn't mind, we have a final slide that just has everybody's closing information on it. We encourage folks to screenshot if you'd like to get involved with the work that NARAL is doing, the work that Planned Parenthood's doing. You can reach out to myself or Steph. Our websites and our social media information is here. And also the information for the 8th is on here, a little description about the movie, how to contact the folks that were involved in the film. If you didn't get a chance to watch the screening, you have until the end of the night tonight. But if you want to host your own screening or are interested in doing any kind of further work around the film, please feel free to reach out to them directly at this website. I'm sure the folks would want to talk to you. They have expressed to us that they want this film to get out to as many people as possible. That's why they made it. And so please engage with them if you have the ability to do so. But I want to thank everybody that was on the panel. This was a fantastic conversation. We're so grateful for the work that you did and for putting it in film form. I really hope that everybody got the opportunity to listen to it and watch it and engage with the campaign. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your time, and thanks for everyone who attended. Please tell your friends about the film and get it out there as much as possible, and keep fighting for abortion access in Ohio.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks, Stephanie and Hannah.